about some things Reagan did. But, I want y'all to see kind of like the history of it, so to speak. So yesterday, or no, Friday, we were not there. We were looking at this, I think, right? Like this silly shirt that I used to collect, like shirts that would be controversial, so I had one of the Ayatollah Khomeini that had the word Ayatollah Assahola on it. And then I had this one, I'd fly 6,300 miles to smoke a camel, anything that was outrageous as possible. And that was the attack on Libya. So don't forget that President Reagan had repeatedly said he would not tolerate acts of terrorism, attacks on American airlines, attacks of hijackings. And so he retaliated on Libya with this attack for their terrorism. But here's the story I was telling you here. And this is the Challenger 7. This lady here is Krista McCullough. She was an astronaut, but she was a teacher. I mean, she was the very first teacher astronaut in history. And, unfortunately, her mission, the whole mission was a terrible catastrophe. You see people on the ground here shocked at it. And really, it was, like I said, it hit the nation's school children. It hit me in person kind of thing. It was a painful moment. And Reagan did a very good job. And this was January of '86 when this happened. But, by far, the biggest controversy of the Reagan presidency has to do with his last 2 years of his administration. And it really requires a little bit of connecting the dots here. It's kind of like with a Watergate break-in, So what had happened was, if you've forgotten, in the country of Nicaragua, there was a leftist government that we covered back here under the leadership of Daniel Ortega called the Sandinistas. So these were, like, when I say leftists, I mean, for lack of a better word, communists. All right. And so here you can see Ortega with Fidel Castro. They're summing it up. And these were communists in Latin America. And so for Reagan, that's terrible. That's like, we don't allow this kind of thing. And so he wanted to utilize federal money, resources, to help the people fighting the Sandinistas. And they were called the Contras, right? So the Congress said, nope, we're not giving financial assistance to this ragtag group of rebels down in Latin America, okay? And this is where I think we really sort of run into some problems with checks and balances, because Reagan is intent that those Contras get weapons and money to them. And so he tells his men, basically, do what you can, take care of this problem. And so within the White House, you have a variety of officials, but one of the most important will be this guy. He is in the National Security Agency, NSA, right? And he is a Marine colonel. His name is Oliver North, all right, or Ollie North. And Ollie North is going to testify before a Senate investigation about what is called the Iran-Contra affair, right? And North will say that the White House, now not necessarily Reagan directly, but like Casper Weinberger, the Secretary of Defense, these guys oversaw this program and gave it approval. So what is the program I'm talking about? So here's where it gets really tricky. Iran at the time, now Iran has been our enemy since pre-Carter. Iran's been our enemy since 79, certainly, since the Iranian Revolution, right? So now it's 7 years after that event, after the capturing of the hostages and stuff. Well, in the meantime, Iran was holding more American hostages. There was at least 3 hostages being held in Iran. Reagan wanted to get those hostages released. He could remember what happened to Carter, today was the 184th day that hostages were held. So he didn't want these hostages held. But the problem was, he had very clearly made repeated statements. The United States does not negotiate with terrorists. You understand? We don't exchange for terrorist actions. That makes them want to do it more, is the argument. But behind the scenes, something different was going on. And what he has done is a shipment of American weapons sent to Iran. All right. Now, when I say he, I'm talking about Oliver North in the NSA and the CIA primarily here. All right. And so those weapons are shipped to Iran. Money is then used to be funneled to the Contras. All right. So that's weird, right? We sell weapons to Iran. The money from the sale of weapons to Iran are then used to provide resources to a group of anti-communist rebels in Nicaragua that we're not supposed to be dealing with, you know? So not only are we negotiating with terrorists, but we're openly violating the law that Congress passed that says you can't do this, right? So this is what I mean about checks and balances. Not only was that going on during this, Gabe mentioned the war on drugs. Well, the CIA was allowing the Colombian and Mexican drug cartel to bring drugs into the United States in exchange for funneling resources to the Contras, right? So we're actually doing not only arms for hostages, but we're allowing arms to flow for drugs. Now, I will point out this, that drug influx ultimately lands in America's inner cities. So as long as the drugs were not disrupting the American, I'll say white people daily life, it wasn't a problem. But out of this comes what's called the nationwide crack epidemic. Have you ever heard of that, crack? Because crack is powdered cocaine into a much smaller format, and it's smokable and it's highly addictive. So, you know, it's like cutting up raw cocaine. And so you have this bizarre scenario. Now, I don't want to confuse the drugs with the Iran-Contra. Iran-Contra was one thing, the drug thing was another thing, but both of these are going on secretly, clandestine operations in Latin America. So what that then leads to is the journalists discovered. As you imagine, it's very hard to keep a secret in this country, particularly in Washington, D.C. And so the media discovers this, and they start reporting on it. And out of this reporting and out of the investigation of Oliver North comes a picture of Ronald Reagan, at least in '86, as being a guy who sleeps through cabinet meetings and isn't paying attention to the details. So it's like he doesn't really care about, you know, all this stuff. He just wants the big picture taken care of, right? Get rid of the Sandinistas. That's all he cares about. He doesn't really care about the details. And that paints this sort of negative picture of President Reagan. Now, you know, jokesters and the cartoonists will make him out to be senile. Well, what we now know about President Reagan is he has Alzheimer's. But we don't know that he has Alzheimer's or not this last year or two in presidency. We do know that he could forget things some. And well, he was in his 70s, you know, so not necessarily a young man anymore. But ultimately, President Reagan will later in life, after his presidency, die of Alzheimer's. And so, not sure. I mean, I've read several books about it, but you know, books about Reagan are always tricky because they're usually written by someone who has like an axe to grind against him, or someone who worked in the Reagan administration and wanted to look really good, you know, so you have this sort of, you know, hard to be sure, but regardless, that's the image that emerges from it. Nevertheless, Reagan remains hugely popular, right? So when he leaves office in '89, he's still going to be one of the highest rated presidents in history and very, very popular. But this is sort of like the darkest stain on his presidency, the Iran-Contra affair, because it either indicates that he had something to do with it, or that he had no idea that his own government was doing it. And either way, that's not good. And Reagan, I'm going to show you all a video now that is perfect Reagan, okay? So I'm going to stop sharing this and take y'all over here to a video because it's one of the most bizarre videos you'll ever listen to. And it's President Reagan on the Iran-Contra affair.
Lift to Iran using Danish ships to carry American arms, of vessels in Spanish ports. At Italian ports and Spanish harbors, and especially unnamed government officials of my administration. Well, now you're going to hear the facts from a White House source, and you know my name. I wanted this time to talk with you about an extremely sensitive and profoundly important matter of foreign policy. For 18 months now, we have had underway a secret diplomatic initiative to Iran. That initiative was undertaken for the simplest and best of reasons: to renew a relationship with the nation of Iran, to bring an honorable end to the bloody 6-year war between Iran and Iraq, to eliminate state-sponsored terrorism and subversion, and to effect the safe return of all hostages. Without Iran's cooperation, we cannot bring an end to the Persian Gulf War. Without Iran's concurrence, there can be no enduring peace in the Middle
The
East.
Persian Gulf War he's
For
referencing
10
is the
days
war
now,
between
the
Iran and
American
Iraq.
world press have
They
been
fought a
full of
10-year
reports
long
and
war.
rumors about this initiative and these objectives. Now, my fellow Americans, there's an old saying that nothing spreads so quickly as a rumor. So I thought it was time to speak with you directly, to tell you firsthand about our dealings with Iran. As Will Rogers once said, rumor travels faster, but it don't stay put as long as truth. So let's get to the facts. The charge has been made that the United States has shipped weapons to Iran as ransom payment for the release of American hostages in Lebanon, that the United States undercut its allies and secretly violated American policy against trafficking with terrorists. Those charges are utterly false. The United States has not made concessions to those who hold our people captive in Lebanon, and we
Okay,
will
so
not.
that sounds pretty good,
The
right?
United States has
Like,
not swapped
definitively,
boatloads
we
of
didn't do it,
plane loads
yeah?
of American.
All right, so now listen.
My fellow Americans, I've said on several occasions that I wouldn't comment about the recent congressional hearings on the Iran-Contra matter until the hearings were over. Well, that time has come, so tonight I want to talk about some of the lessons we've learned. But rest assured, that's not my sole subject this evening. I also want to talk about the future and getting on with things because the people's business is waiting. These past 9 months have been confusing and painful ones for the country. I know you have doubts in your own minds about what happened in this whole episode. What I hope is, not in doubt, however, is my commitment to the investigations themselves. So far, we've had 4 investigations by the Justice Department, the Tower Board, the Independent Counsel, and the Congress. I requested 3 of those investigations, and I endorsed and cooperated fully with the 4th, the congressional hearings, supplying over 250,000 pages of White House documents, including parts of my own private diaries. Once I realized I hadn't been fully informed, I sought to find the answers. Some of the answers I don't like. As the Tower Board reported, and as I said last March, our original initiative rapidly got all tangled up in the sale of arms, and the sale of arms got tangled up with hostages. Secretary Shultz and Secretary Weinberger both predicted that the American people would immediately assume this whole plan was an arms for hostages deal and nothing more. Well, unfortunately, their predictions were right. As I said to you in March, I let my preoccupation with the hostages intrude into areas where it didn't belong. The image, the reality of Americans in chains, deprived of their freedom and families so far from home, burdened my thoughts, and this was a mistake. My fellow Americans, I've thought long and often about how to explain to you what I intended to accomplish, but I respect you too much to make excuses. The fact of the matter is that there's nothing I can say that will make the situation right. I was stubborn in my pursuit of a policy that went astray. The other major issue of the hearings, of course, was the diversion of funds to the Nicaraguan Contras. Colonel North and Admiral Poindexter believed they were doing what I would have wanted done, keeping the democratic resistance alive in Nicaragua. I believed then, and I believe now, in preventing the Soviets from establishing a beachhead in Central America. Since I have been so closely associated with the cause of the Contras, the big question during the hearings was whether I knew of the diversion. I was aware the resistance was receiving funds directly from third countries and from private efforts, and I endorsed those endeavors wholeheartedly. But let me put this in capital letters. I did not know about the diversion of funds. Indeed, I didn't know there were excess funds. Yet the buck does not stop with Admiral Poindexter, as he stated in his testimony. It stops with me. I am the one who is ultimately accountable to the American people. The Admiral testified that he wanted to protect me, yet no president should ever be protected from the truth. No operation is so secret that it must be kept from the Commander-in-Chief. I had the right, the obligation, to make my own decision. I heard someone the other day ask why I wasn't outraged. Well, at times, I've been mad as a hornet. Anyone would be. Just look at the damage that's been done and the time that's been lost. But I've always found that the best therapy for outrage and anger is action. I've tried to take steps so that what we've been through can't happen again. The problem goes deeper.
I want to hear it.
Their usefulness. Operational role by the...
Okay, so in this speech that he delivers, he says, 9 months ago, I told you that we weren't doing this thing. And in my heart, I still believe that, even though the facts don't bear that out. So it's really this bizarre moment. But the thing about Reagan in this, I think, is how successful he is able to take responsibility for something. And by and large, the American people give him a pass on it. Now, certainly he will have his critics. You understand? But I mean, this is a major shady operation. But because it seems to be guys like Ollie North, and, it's kind of patriotic in a sense that they're, trying to get rid of communists. The problem is they are circumventing Congress, like overtly doing what Congress said don't do. But President Reagan is going to survive this as the Teflon president. In other words, Iran, contra to any other president, would have been it. That might have been the end, And when we get to Bill Clinton in 1997, when he openly denies having a sexual relationship with a woman in the White House, like directly to the American people want to believe him. Okay. And then he comes on a couple months later and he's like, I didn't tell you the truth. At that point, everybody kind of figured he was lying. It was too late. So Reagan kind of heads this off at the pass, to use an old cowboy movie, right? In other words, once it starts becoming clear that it is the White House that's involved in this, but the critics of it will say that Reagan should have known. Maybe he should have had a better grip on what his policy was, the policy under him was being. And that's what he said about, the buck should stop with him. However, I don't think this will, in the end, it doesn't take Reagan out of the top 10. Like Reagan is still in the top 10 of American presidents. And so probably because of his economic legacy. Now, this is how history's funny. I don't know singularly what caused the boom of the 80s. Okay. I'm sure Reagan's tax cuts were beneficial, certainly to some people. I know that the tight money policies of the Fed in the early 80s were certainly beneficial. And I know that recessions in American history are cyclical, like we go through them and we emerge out of them, Regardless, the second half of President Reagan's presidency was a booming economic period. And so his supporters are going to argue it is the effect of his economic policies, which are, criticized as trickle down. But, the idea behind trickle down is that as the rich have their taxes cut, this will create more capital. So when we call it supply side economics, which are criticized as trickle down economics, is the idea that if you reduce the amount of monetary supply, you'll stave off inflation, right? And then if you expand access to capital by cutting taxes, this will grow the amount of business construction and creation. So, in principle, it sounds pretty good. The problem is, and this is the overwhelming criticism of Reaganomics or trickle down, is that it appears to not necessarily trickle far enough. So, in other words, during the Reagan administration era, you will see the rich. I think I showed you this data the other day. The wealthiest of American people will get wealthier, and the lowest income of American people will get poorer. So if you're looking at how these charts go, the lowest 20th percentile will shrink in terms of their income. The middle class will shrink, and the wealthiest, particularly the 5%, will get wealthier. So that's kind of the long-term criticism of Republican economics in general, certainly since the days of Andrew Mellon in the 1920s. And this is still very much within the realm of sort of Republican orthodoxy. The difference is, back then at least, President Reagan would say he was going to cut the federal budget, right? Now, that did not prove to be true. And so if I'm calculating Reagan's legacy, this is my biggest concern, all right? Granted, I don't like the fact that poor people got poorer and that the middle class shrunk some under Reagan. I don't like that. But what I really don't like is Reagan, who you will see massive deficits, right? I mean, look at the deficit here. That's the Reagan era.
Is that just from the arms race?
Well, it's not simply from the arms race, it's from cutting $2 trillion in taxes. So here's the problem. It doesn't shrink the federal budget, right? Now, I should explain a concept that Reagan supporters and Reagan himself seem to believe in. They never were politically foolish enough to say this, but let me show you a concept that has been associated with his presidency and with a concept involving tax cuts. So if you want to get rid of the Great Society, if you want to get rid of, all those entitlement programs that LBJ created, you starve the beast, right? So I told you about neocons, right? So what's starving the beast? What's starving the beast, you reckon? Okay, so here's the thing, y'all. If the Congress is spending enormous budgets, right, on social policy, so keep in mind, social policy doesn't make up that much of the overall federal budget today, but I'll show you what I'm talking about here. So percent of the federal budget in terms of social policy. All right, let me show y'all what I'm talking about. So percent of the federal budget, and let's just pick one, let's say 1984, right? So the federal budget by category, let's see here, what's that say? No, I want it by category. All right, I'll just use a current one and I'll take y'all back to those days. So if you're trying to starve the beast, you take a look at the federal budget. Now, this is the modern budget. And I know budgetary stuff is not the most interesting thing for students, but if you're going to talk about Reagan, you got to have to understand. So under President Reagan, what was dramatically increased? What did he spend trillions in throughout the president? Military spending, not just the arms race. He mentioned the M1 tank, right? Thousands of M1A1 Abrams tanks are built, okay? Black Hawk helicopters are built. So all, F-16 fighter planes are built. So lots and lots of defense spending. Defense spending grows dramatically. So what he cuts is what we call discretionary spending, right? So mandatory spending, okay, is Social Security and Medicare, right? It means you are entitled to it because of law. So he doesn't mess with that. In fact, he owns a Social Security Commission to extend the life of Social Security, which raises payroll taxes and raises the how old you have to be to receive, which makes Social Security last a lot longer. I applaud him for that. He does that with the Democratic Congress. But what he cuts are all those programs for the poor. So the argument goes that, well, how will the budget be balanced? Well, by cutting taxes, right? Well, guys, none of Reagan's years are balanced. Like none of them. They're all deficits, right? As far as the eye can see. So what happens then is if you're running massive deficits, and it's, let's say a Democrat comes in, like say Bill Clinton, right? Bill Clinton can't keep funding what things? Because you spent all the money. Like social programs, right? Like welfare and food stamps and, all those things that help the poorest of Americans, who don't vote, right? And also, if you just do butter and not guns, can you afford that as a society? Just ask Sweden, right? But if you're doing guns and butter, which one's going to have to get cut if you're Reagan? Butter, right? So he's going to make heavy cuts to domestic social spending in his budget. And he's going to have those Southern Democrats, those boll weevils, vote with him, right? Go with him as well as the Republican Party. So it's called starve the beast because you're cutting off what? You're cutting off funds because the budget is in deficit so much. So that in the future, when you have under Bill Clinton, the welfare reform bill passed, that doesn't sound like a liberal Democrat, right? Like the idea of ending welfare as we know it coming out of a Democrat's mouth. Well, Reagan somewhere was happy as a clam, right? Because these things are unsustainable. You can't do this forever. And so then the government and the country has to decide, well, what are we going to pay for? Well, I just told you what's a huge chunk of it that we have to pay for. So you have to pay for Social Security. You have to pay for Medicare. Those are old people and they do vote. You have to pay for defense. That's number 3. And number 4 is interest. So once you get all of that stuff, all that's left is just a small skosh. 7.8%. Now, I know you're looking at this and you're saying, well, that's $1 trillion. That's not a small skosh. But keep in mind, the other is $4 trillion, right? So eventually, these things will all be squeezed out, and it won't be anything but Social Security, Medicare, defense, and interest. And then no more college tuition assistance, right? No more food stamp programs. And that's exactly what conservatives wanted to do. They wanted to choke out social spending, right? And the best way to do that, you could argue, is doing it how? Cutting taxes, so the revenues go down, right? Now, the orthodoxy that they're claiming is if you cut taxes, we'll balance the budget. Well, did that happen? Not remotely. There was no balancing of the budget anywhere in Reagan's years. I mean, you see it just goes up, 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 right? So what was cut were, well, welfare programs, food stamp programs, housing programs. One of the most tragic things that were cut, and I didn't put a thing in here about it, but it certainly makes sense with this picture, is President Reagan is going to make major cuts to the Center for Disease Control. At the same time that what has become an epidemic? Look down here in the lower right. AIDS. Guys, President Reagan doesn't even mention AIDS for 3 years after it's come back. Because this is the moral majority's headline, AIDS is a homosexual disease. That's literally what they said. It's gay people disease. So why would we particularly be concerned about that as good conservatives, right? Hey, in fact, this pastor said that this was a plague sent from God to get rid of homosexuals. So this is where, where I sort of lost interest in being a part of some of this stuff, where you have the kind of connection between the theory that somehow AIDS has sexual orientation, right? And that's preposterous. But, that made for really good talk for the moral majority if you're opposed to the radical left, right? So again, when you talk about trickle down or you talk about supply side, keep in mind, what's Keynesian economics? Stimulate what part of the economic curve? Demand. Demand is us, we the people. We're not really supply oriented, right? The supply is to focus on the other half and say, we need to put money where? In businesses' hands. Very similar to Hoover when he does what thing? The Reconstruction Finance Corporation. See, that's an AP kind of connection. So when RFC comes along and Hoover's dealing with depression, Hoover doesn't put money in whose hands? Citizens, so to speak. He puts it in the businesses and banks' hands. Well, that's kind of what this is, right? But what we know about them frequently is they save their money. They don't just, in the midst of a downturn in the economy, typically do banks and businesses go out and spur investment? No, they hold on to it because there have been runs on their business and panicking and things like that. So I find this stuff terrible. I'm not gonna lie to you. I am vehemently opposed to it because all it does is ultimately makes rich people richer and then this, right? And you are the guys who are gonna have to pay for their rich being richer. That bothers me, okay? And of course, poor people aren't gonna pay. Why? They don't have any income. They don't pay income taxes, right? So it's all gonna come down on the middle class. And I just find that absolutely disastrous. So I consider this his worst legacy. Unbelievable deficits that have never gone down. The national debt since then, and man, look at it after Obama and Trump and Biden. It's what is this? Is this like, that's close to $5.5 trillion, right? This year's past budget was 4.3 trillion, right? 1 year. So deficit wise. So we're current deficit. I know you guys are like, oh no, not the national debt clock, right? But well, here's the deal though. This was the point in history where we didn't need to do this. We didn't need to go that far. All right. So if I go to the national debt clock today, it is 28 trillion. 28 trillion. So from the span of 5.5 trillion in 99 was 22 years ago, right? It's jumped 23 trillion since then, which is the sum of all of that added up. So this, by the way, when President Bush was being advised by his vice president on tax cuts, keep in mind, President Bush cuts over 2 trillion in taxes. His vice president, Dick Cheney, said, talking to the chairman of the Treasury Secretary, he said, Paul, Reagan proved that deficits don't matter. What do you think he meant? What does nobody get elected on? Running against the deficit. Like, who gives a crap? Right? Like, people don't care. It's just an idea. Probably, yeah, since it ranks in my top 5 of priorities. And the reason why, it's not because it's going to hurt me. See, this is the problem. Like, America, somewhere along the way, went from being selfless, like caring for our fellow citizens, to so selfish that all we care about is this moment. right? And we don't see the long-term effect of that. And I find that disastrous. You know, it's just totally cruel. So some critics would say Republicans were starving the beast. One of the most famous conservatives of his day said, I want to have government so small I can drown it in a bathtub. Now, think about what that means, because this is the other component of new federalism. This is the guy's name. His name is Grover Norquist, and he actually runs the Americans for Tax Reform, and they have the no tax pledge. All Republicans have to sign a no tax pledge. I will never raise taxes. Republicans sign. That's like today. There's Grover Norquist, and he says, I don't want to abolish government. I simply want to reduce it to the size where I can drag it in the bathroom and drown it in the bathtub. So think about history. Small government. This sounds like when and who? Who? Jefferson, right. That government which governs best governs least, right? What is the worst thing you can ever hear when you go to answer your door? Reagan asked us, I'm here from the government and I'm here to help. Right? You know, like this was really a period in history where politically it became overtly popular to run against the government. So in other words, because of the 60s and 70s, what thing is now bad? The government. And we have never recovered from it. We have never recovered. You know, we run against the government in this country routinely, and people criticize the government. Guys, Congress has the same popularity ranking as cockroaches and Nickelback. All right, just to show you how bad they are. All right, and I'm not making this up. There have been public opinion polls of how bad is Congress, as bad as Nickelback. I'll show you what I'm talking about. Yeah, right. Like people would rather deal with cockroaches than have to deal with Congress. I'll show you the poll that was done. Congress is less popular than cockroaches, traffic jams, head lice, Nickelback, colonoscopy, Genghis Khan, Brussels sprouts. You know, so that just tells you colonoscopy. And this is like an actual public opinion poll, you know, done in 2013. So go check it out sometime. It's, you know, if you thought Nickelback was bad, wait till you see Congress. So the point is that since the 80s and even 70s, think about Carter. He runs as a political outsider. He runs against the swamp, Washington, right? So all these guys are running against the swamp, so to speak. And I think in principle, reducing the size of the federal government is not a bad idea. But he didn't really reduce it. He just shifted where the money went, right? And he increased the money to defense. But you can argue that was the Cold War. You know, the Cold War, that's how we won it. Some people make that argument. But we have never paid it off. That bill is overdue, right? Well, Clinton tried to fix it with Congress, with the House of Representatives, and they balanced 3 budgets. And we had surpluses. And then we had W. Bush. So, you know, very quickly, instead of paying it on down, we're like, hey, let's cut $2 trillion in taxes. Oh, and then 9/11 happens. And after that, it's just from one crisis to the next. You know what I mean? So we had a brief window where we did reduce the deficit and the national debt. The clock stopped. There's a national debt clock up in New York City that can't run backwards. So they had to turn it off, you know, because it was the debt was decreasing, and it didn't go that way, you know. So it's been reopened since then. So yeah, I'd be aware of that, and keep in mind that today's presidents have. I mean, if Biden wants to spend $4 trillion on infrastructure, he can do it, but he's going to have to cut the last 3. I mean, eliminate the last 3 tax cuts. The last 3 tax cuts generated about that much money. So my theory is don't cut any taxes, don't increase any spending, pay off the debt, and then we're good to go, right? And then in Virginia, we have a law, and Congress had it for a minute, called pay as you go, which means no deficits. We don't even have borrowing hardly as Virginia. We have rainy day fund. We have like a savings account. We're the best rated state in America for economics, like one of the top 3 together. They're grouped together. So managing your money well is a hallmark of a strong country. Making future generations handle it is what Greece did. All right. And that really didn't work out, you know. And see, we don't even have a social state, like a socialized country. We're not like Greece or Italy.
Like you said before, there's like a theory where you don't even have to
Oh, yeah. MMT. Well, I'm not going to teach you about MMT before the AP exam, but write down on your notes the letter MMT. And you do have to pay your debt. Don't get me wrong. But who determines interest rates? The MMT arguments made. Your government, right? And so who can make your interest rates low? Your government. And then that means the interest you pay on your debt is low and you can kind of pay. The problem is the Fed is not tied to the debt for interest. The Fed is tied to inflation for interest. See the difference? And the national debt is a driver often of inflation. Like if we're creating lots of money like we're currently doing, you know, but at the end of the day, the Fed isn't responsible for paying down the national debt. That's not our concern. That's not the Fed's concern. You understand? So the MMT is the argument that the government can just print more money and set interest rates and pay on it sometime in the distant future. And that might be true, but I don't think it's good when it's $28 trillion, right? Because at some point the interest, even if it's low interest, right? The interest payments are so high, they squeeze out other stuff. I mean, if you're paying $1 trillion annually in interest, that's a whole lot of college tuition you could just pay for right there. That's a whole lot of access to healthcare you could have paid for. A whole lot of affordable housing. You see what I mean? Like, and all you're doing is paying for it in interest. So, I mean, as a homeowner, I can tell you about how interest works. You know, it's sucky. All right, so be aware of this. And the other major criticism of it, not only does it explode the national debt, it doesn't actually improve the lives of ordinary citizens at the bottom of the rung, so to speak. That's the big argument. In other words, it doesn't trickle enough. It might trickle a little bit. Like if you own a company that makes speedboats, you might be doing all right, right? Or if you're owning a company that makes personal jets, you know, you're doing pretty good because they're buying up personal jets. But if you're a kid, like a 22-year-old parent working at Walmart, this doesn't help you out, right? Like at all. So you get the idea. Now, I told you there was a new dynamic in the American electoral system that is much bigger in some respects than even Ronald Reagan. So it emerges really in the 70s. And I mentioned that Jimmy Carter was an evangelical Christian. He's a fundamentalist. He's a Southern Baptist, but he is not a part of this group. You understand? This group is very familiar to us in this community. They are called the religious right as a group, but really the first organized group of them is called the moral majority. So this is a political action committee. It was a group designed to mobilize Christians in the South particularly, but around the country, around political issues. After seeing, for example, cases on abortion, activities of homosexuals, the end of prayer in schools, as they called it, the end of Bible reading in schools, this is a group of Christians who were outraged at the direction it seemed the country was going. And Ronald Reagan, who was not that religious of a guy, was tremendous at talking religiously. If you actually read his biography and study him, Reagan wasn't really like, well, Jimmy Carter, for example, overtly religious, but he certainly knew how to quote the Bible well. I'll put it that way. Kind of like Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln didn't start out as a very religious dude at all, but he certainly knew how to use the Bible for its wisdom and for teaching purposes. Reagan's going to have a comment I think he makes about God, being in God we trust, and one nation under God. He talks about these Supreme Court rulings taking God out of it. It doesn't make sense, My response to that is the Supreme Court said God is not important anymore in those things. In other words, the word God and in God we trust is so secularized, it doesn't mean anything. So I don't think that's what religious people really want, right? Do we really want the under God to not mean anything? One nation under God? Nah. So anyway, what did the moral majority try to do? Well, they, first of all, began to create TV shows. So this is a period we call televangelists. So they had TV shows that would come into your home, and it would be very, very, Christian oriented, but at the same time, politically oriented. So they would talk about current events and how they were godless and sinful. And folks, this had kind of come up, remember the Soviet Union was atheist, right? So even since the days of Eisenhower, religious revivals, this group existed. They were out there, but they're going to become overtly politically active. And they're going to try to really reverse the counterculture. So the culture of the 60s, the culture of liberalism, the culture of drug use, the culture of long shaggy hair and homosexuality and, all the feminism and, these things were destroying the traditional structure of the family. So this is where I would get into explaining it as a political conservative movement. Conservatives by philosophy are routinely opposed to change, certainly dramatic change, and are very supportive of tradition and institutions, right? Well, the church and family are two of the most traditional institutions in human history, right? And they felt both of those things were being undermined by the US government, right? And so they're going to go after this stuff hardcore, and they're going to be led by this guy. This is Jerry Falwell. Here's Pat Robertson. He's going to create the Christian Broadcast Network, and a college. Both of these men create universities directly for Christian religion education. They're going to be, so even if you're a lawyer or an accountant, you're going to be educated in a Christian environment. That's the objective here. And they were very, very close to President Reagan. And here you can see, I told you that Reagan he didn't, the CDC's, like part of the CDC that does research on viruses, they actually cut the funding for it during the AIDS epidemic. And they refused to allow, initially AIDS' name was GRID. The original name for AIDS was GRID, which was gay-related infectious disease. And they changed the name because they being the CDC, didn't want to be blacklisted. In other words, the disease wouldn't be mentioned in medical journals because it had the word gay in it. So they changed it to acquired immune deficiency syndrome. And it was during the 80s that the AIDS epidemic was so terrible. I mean, it's still terrible around the world, but it was so terrible here in America. And it wasn't until one of President Reagan's personal friends, an actor named Rock Hudson, who had been secretly homosexual, died of AIDS, did President Reagan even mention the word. He just wasn't comfortable because he knew that it bothered people. He didn't talk about it. All right, so be familiar with the moral majority, Jerry Falwell, Christian Coalition, as they'll be called later. Reagan is going to have an opportunity to reshape the Supreme Court, and he does. Now, Nixon had tried to reshape the Supreme Court and had been disappointed. He had thought he was putting conservatives on, and he didn't. Reagan is going to put 4 conservatives on the bench, and you're going to start to see, particularly against affirmative action, cases reducing the how access to abortion was available. And he will also break the glass ceiling of the Supreme Court. He will appoint the first female Supreme Court justice. She's from Arizona. She's a conservative. As she goes older in life, she becomes a moderate swing voter on the court, like before she retired. She retired from the court about a decade back to take care of her ailing husband. But her name is Sandra Day O'Connor. And she was a very strong presence on the Supreme Court for 30 years. So I would be familiar, of course, with her. He will, at the end of Reagan's presidency, you will have a very strong conservative Supreme Court in terms of orientation. Okay. So, affirmative action started under Lyndon Johnson. And what it is that if you were a federal agent, like if you were working with the federal government, so federal agency, a business that was employed by the federal government for contracts, then you had to make an effort to hire minorities. All right. So it's a remedial action trying to correct some past grievance, like discrimination. Under President Nixon, he created what was called the Philadelphia Plan, which was actually to assign statistical quotas. So you had to have like 8% or 12% African Americans. And so just to give you an example, although I don't have specific examples in front of me, but if you were to think like, let's say you were going to hire a construction company, all right, and you put it out for contract, for bid, and under the federal guidelines, 5% of the construction work or 10% had to be done by an African American owned business. And, you get a couple dozen white owned businesses and then 2 black owned businesses. Well, probably one of those, regardless if it's a better company or not, would get hired. And that's the kind of stuff that prompted anger by a lot of white people, reverse discrimination, particularly in hiring. So this court is going to sort of say, that's right, no more quota. Because remember, this has already had the Bakke decision. Remember that Alan Bakke, the case involving education and affirmative action. By the way, I didn't mention Nixon's Southern strategy, which is the dog whistle use of racist tone. So even though he does things like affirmative action, he clearly campaigns to Southern whites as the party of Southern whites, you know, like as a Republican. And I didn't talk about Southern strategy, I forgot to. So what are some of the cases you need to know? Well, there's 2 cases involving affirmative action. So since the Backey case, you have Ward's Cove, which is, you know, a company, a business, and Martin v. Wilkes. Now, I don't think they'll ever ask you specific court cases, and I'm not going to ask you these on the quiz, simply though they make it virtually impossible for an employer to discriminate in its hiring processes against white people. So keep in mind, you know, and later on, when a piece of the Civil Rights Act is going to be ruled unconstitutional by Justice Roberts, Chief Justice Roberts, he's going to say, the only way to end discrimination is to end discrimination. It means don't discriminate against white people, you know, for the benefit of black people or other minorities. So this court will be much opposed to any sort of numeric system of hiring based on color. Okay, and I mentioned that today. It is illegal to hire someone based on race. It's just illegal. You can't do that as discrimination. But you can't really find a way. But it's also illegal to not hire someone based on race. But it's hard to prove that you didn't get hired because of color of your skin. You know, and that's kind of where we are today. And so advocates against this would say, well, how can we correct this discrimination? The answer is you have to catch people when they're guilty. And unfortunately, that's not that easy, especially if the government's not funding, you know, Equal Employment Opportunity Commission and things like that. I would like you to know the 2 court cases dealing with abortion. So I told you there have been 3 major Supreme Court cases dealing with abortion. Obviously, Roe v. Wade is the most important. It's a precedent, we call it. But you've got Webster and Casey. Webster is the first case to say a state cannot pass laws that prevent women from having access to abortion. However, it may make reasonable restrictions, right? So in other words, you can't block. I think this case particularly was involving a ban, and you can't ban. You have to, if you don't account for the health and well-being of the mother, then it's not constitutional, at least as of right now. In other words, if a mother is going to give birth and her child delivery might kill her, then the law allows that to be considered a legitimate reason for an abortion. All right, that's the health and safety of the mother. Since Casey, you've had a new terminology that says undue burden, right? And so what you're going to find in states like Virginia, when it was Republican dominated, is efforts to put greater restrictions on women's access to abortion. So it might involve things like informed consent of the husband, like the husband has to give permission. If you're a minor, your parents have to give consent. Later in Virginia history, we're going to use things like an attempt to use things like vaginal ultrasounds as a medical procedure prescribed by the government. So lots of debate about what is an undue burden. But if you'll notice, the last 2 cases particularly are made by conservatives, conservative majority case. And so you'll see here, neither case reversed Roe. Now, it does allow states to make some restrictions, like I said, but it does not reverse Roe. And, you know, I don't think that's going to ever happen, honestly, based on these precedents and Roe itself. You have to undermine privacy rights. And so you can make it hard. And I mentioned the other day, you can tax the procedures, but I don't think you can prohibit it without getting into these privacy rights issues. And of course, women who are pro-choice are going to be very active in trying to resist both judges being appointed and rulings that are, you know, limiting a woman's right to choose. Speaking of justices that would have done that, this is Judge Bork. Now, I mentioned the Saturday Night Massacre the other day. You guys remember the Saturday Night Massacre, where Nixon wants to have fired his special prosecutor? The attorney general and the deputy attorney general won't do it. Well, here's the guy he finds to do it. And Robert Bork was a brilliant conservative thinker and a judge. He was a circuit court judge for D.C. He was a scholar who, during the investigation, not the hearings, he was asked about views on judicial philosophy, and he overtly talked about being a judicial conservative. And by that I mean strict interpretation of the Supreme Court. So I mean, of the Constitution. So you guys remember the Federalists and Anti-Federalists? Like, if it ain't in there, you can't do it. That's strict, right? Anti-Federalist position. If it's not expressed, then it's prohibited, right? Well, that's him. he literally was an originalist, you know, like if it ain't in there. So take privacy rights. Privacy rights are not in the Constitution. The Fourth Amendment and the Ninth Amendment is what the Supreme Court said, make it your rights. The Bork was an originalist. And during the Senate hearing, this fella went to town on it. And so you might recognize this guy. This is Senator Joe Biden of Delaware, right beside it. And he was the chairman of the Judiciary Committee, the committee that determines whether or not a judge becomes a Supreme Court justice. Beside him here is Ted Kennedy, you know, who was the minority member below him. And so Senator Biden and Senator Kennedy just went into the Judge Bork. They like tore him up and said, look, you know, you don't believe in your world. Ted Kennedy gives a speech like in Judge Bork's world, there's all these freedoms go away. Okay. And so they voted him down. They voted Bork down. He lost. Instead, they got a very sort of moderate to right justice named Stephen Breyer. So what I mean by that is that there's a term for when the Senate, particularly the Senate committee, like openly tries to tank your hearing, and it's called getting borked today. You know, so if you're borked, you know, they're like coming at you. And they did. The Dems went after Bork hardcore. And Bork kind of made it easy on him because he did talk about reversing things and being a real conservative. And, you know, stare decisis is not enough of a decision if it violates the Bill of Rights. So this guy goes down, and he will still be sort of a champion of conservatism on the courts down in D.C., but he will not be appointed to the Supreme Court. He voted down. And the guy who leads the charge against him is Joe Biden. So, you know, when people talk about Biden, I remember this stuff, you know, and I've taught this stuff for a while. So Biden's been around for 40 years, you know, in Washington. You're talking about the ultimate Washington insider. Now, right at the end of Reagan's presidency, the economy went in the toilet, basically. And it had to do with the go-go 80s, I think. So the go-go 80s were, you know, people really did what you would think people would do when money was cheap and people were spending money a lot. They over what? What do you always do? They overspeculated, right? Only this time they overspeculated in housing. So housing had its own banking system. Well, there were banks, but they were different. They weren't under the FDIC, and that's important. And they're called savings and loans, S&Ls, sometimes called thrifts, if you ever hear that. So these S&Ls collapsed. They just went into the toilet, right? And so when they were created with deposit insurance, then they did even worse. So these people were like wildcat banks. You guys remember that term? You know, loaded their money in a really ridiculous manner. And here Reagan has to bail them out. And then 2 years later, we're going to bail out another $150 billion worth. So this is the first real banking fiasco in my lifetime. It had an enormous downturn on the stock market. And what it showed is that people had over-borrowed and built houses they couldn't afford. Sound vaguely familiar? That's the major engine for the Great Recession, right? So lots of this were bailed out. So what this creates is what's called moral hazard. So if your business behaves stupidly and expects the government to bail it out, then that's called moral hazard. It's behaving immorally because a business isn't supposed to be stupid. It's not supposed to be reckless. But if it thinks the government will save it from being reckless, it will lead to this kind of stuff. So throughout the end of his presidency into President Bush's presidency, the S&L scandal happened.
So that's kind of like.
Yeah, absolutely. Or Bear Stearns, you know, which was the first company that drove the housing collapse. The toxic assets, you guys remember that term? They loaned money to too many people that couldn't pay them, especially when interest rates changed. And they just thought that, well, interest rates would stay great forever and people would just pay their bill, you know, and they didn't. So plus you can see this, the houses were becoming harder to sell. That's the other great problem. When you make too many houses and then you can't sell them, then you're stuck with the cost of building, you know, and that happened here in the S&L scandal. So Reagan is going to leave office very popular. And one of the ways we know this is the election of 1988. So in 1988, the Democrats are kind of running a smorgasbord of candidates here. And the guy who emerges from it is Massachusetts Senator Michael Dukakis, and governor, he's been governor. But Michael Dukakis, that's his name right here. I put this picture in because he broke the cardinal rule of presidential campaigning, and that's never have your picture taken in a funny hat, right? Or looking funny in a hat. So Michael Dukakis rode around in this tank to try to look tough, and instead he kind of looked like a kid. You know, he's like this little guy with his big helmet riding around. And, you know, he had virtually no personality, it seemed, on TV. And he's going to go up against the former vice president. President Reagan's vice president is George Herbert Walker Bush. So if you'll hear me call him HW, that's this guy. His son will be president. This is President 41. His son will be President 43, and we just call him W, right? So H.W. Bush is this guy. And he, you know, the expression is he was born with a silver spoon in his mouth, right? His father was a U.S. Senator, Prescott Bush, right? He became a congressman, then a senator, then the United Nations ambassador, right? And then he was the director of the CIA. So President Bush, Vice President Bush, soon to be President Bush, was a very, very much Washington insider, but he was kind of a cloak and dagger guy. He was also a war hero from World War II, and he was not a kind of guy who was used to politicking much. Unlike Reagan, who was a showman, Bush was actually a very modest kind of reserved dude. You understand? This Bush. And so he's in some ways quite different. This election also featured a new candidate who was a serious candidate for the first time in American history for the nomination of the Democratic Party. And he's an African-American preacher. He was a good personal friend of Martin Luther King. Jesse Jackson was with Dr. King on the Lorraine Motel when he was shot. Like, he was on the balcony. And so Jackson ran what he called the Rainbow Coalition. He ran twice for president. And he did get black votes, but he made sort of the cardinal error of campaigning, which Obama is definitely not going to do. Jesse Jackson ran in 84 and 88 as really the black candidate for kind of like black people, right? Obama doesn't do that. When Obama runs in 2008, he does not run as like the black candidate. He runs as a candidate, you know, and he's not talking about singularly black issues, you know. And so Jackson kind of pigeonholed himself by running, you know, obviously he was a liberal and to the left of well, not to the left of Dukakis, but nonetheless, Bush very comfortably wins this election, as you can see. Not as resoundingly as the 88 election with Reagan, but 84 election with Reagan, you know, that landslide election. But he does pretty well. Handful of places. Here you start to see the Northwest becoming a liberal place, Washington and Oregon. You know, we associate that as Dem voters. But so in comes President Bush. And I told you President Bush is really going to enjoy the end of the Cold War. Now, the first place that Bush has a kind of a challenge is in China. And the problem in China, he ran on being, as he said, a kinder, gentler America. He ran on what were called 1,000 points of light. Like, he would inspire local service, and, you know, it was kind of a soft campaign, not really that mean. He did run one of the most infamous ads in history, though, the Willie Horton ad. He depicted Dukakis as letting prisoners out and then committing rape. Yeah, so tough on crime. That was HW. But the picture I'm showing you here, and I remember watching this, was Tiananmen Square in Beijing in '89, and the Chinese, under a leader named Deng Xiaoping, had begun reforming China. After Mao died, he started modernizing China, and so China had, you know, McDonald's had come to China, and, you know, businesses were becoming privatized. Some capitalism was creeping in, you know, some free markets. And so college students who could choose Coke or Pepsi now wanted to have some say in who their government was. And so thousands and thousands of these kids meet in the huge open square in Beijing called Tiananmen Square. And Deng Xiaoping sends in tank columns, and they slaughter them. I mean, they massacre these kids. And it's on television. Now, I showed you the Challenger explosion, right? Did you guys notice what was in the corner of it? What 3 letters? CNN, right? So it's the 80s that provides us with 24-hour news. This is the first time in history where we can watch the news whenever we want, basically. And I remember watching this, you know, on cable, and they ran the American reporters out. They took their cameras and kicked them out, and you know, and that's when I knew that China wasn't really democracy. You know, it wasn't even remotely close to that yet. That's the moment when I decided that I didn't want Americans to do business, me to trade with Chinese until they acted more like us. But that hasn't happened. However, this happens, and this will be by far the biggest event of President Bush's presidency, the end of the Cold War. So what happened was in '89, so, that's the year Bush takes office, the Iron Curtain collapses. The Iron Curtain. So no more communists in Poland, no more communists in Hungary, no more communists in Romania. Ceausescu's government's overthrown. So, and then this happens. And boy, I remember watching this. I was 16 and in high school, and people all around the country are like, this is it. You could order pieces of the wall. So when the Berlin Wall came down, it was like the Cold War ended. Now, the Cold War didn't technically end until Christmas of 1990. In Christmas of 1990, a group of Russian people overthrew Mikhail Gorbachev. Now, they didn't kill him. They didn't execute him. Thank goodness. He's a good guy. But they got rid of him, and they declared the Republic of Russia. And with that, this man, Boris Yeltsin, became the first president of Russia in history. So Gorbachev ended, not with a bang, though. They didn't kill him. And with that, there was no more Soviet Union. Just like that, 1990, the Soviet Union ceased to exist. Now, they continue to create a relationship with the Soviet bloc countries. They call it the CIS, Commonwealth of Independent States, right? It's like a coalition, kind of like a confederacy. But today, those countries are independent, with maybe the exception of Ukraine. Russia has really been active lately, trying to take pieces of Ukraine. Well, not just trying; they have been taking pieces of Ukraine. But they claim it's theirs, so this is the kind of border stuff that we're going to be dealing with. But the Cold War was over, and it really didn't end the way people thought it was going to end. They thought like one side or the other was going to obliterate them, and it kind of ended with a whimper, not a bang, And that was beautiful. It was so cool, because the next year we're fighting a war in Iraq, and we're like, oh yeah, the Cold War's over. That was it. So that's Eastern Europe. You had when I was your age in high school, all I had to study for maps was Soviet Union, right? When I was in college taking human geography, I had to learn 15 countries in the former Soviet Union. I had to learn how to spell Azerbaijan and Kyrgyzstan. And I didn't have to know that before. Right on. So, the biggest post thing after the end of the Cold War is what about the nukes? Because the nuclear stockpile of the Soviet Union was spread across those CIS countries, right? And you may recall there was a treaty called SALT II, right? Well, now there's going to be a treaty called START II, and that is going to begin reducing the long-range nuclear missiles. So today, all of our countries, Russia, France, India, we want to see reduction in nuclear arms, and we have been steadily doing it. We're actually destroying our old nukes, and we're helping countries around the world that can't really do that as well. All the warheads, fissile material is being stored in this giant hole in Kazakhstan. It goes I forget how far down, but it's like a mammoth concrete, multiple reinforced storage container for the Soviets' arsenal. So I would be familiar with that. I don't think you ever have to know about Chechnya, but Chechnya is still to this day fighting with Russia. These are a part of the Soviet Union, part of Russia that did not successfully break away when the Soviet Union fell apart. So I would definitely be aware of Chechnya. Okay. But I don't think you'll have to be tested on it. All right. And so this is what the beginning of the peace dividend. So tomorrow we'll talk about the peace dividend and President Clinton. All right. Because President Clinton is the first president who gets to really appreciate not spending trillions of dollars on the military spending. Because you don't have to. You don't have a Cold War to do anymore, right? So I'll be here this afternoon now to start a review if you're interested on the next periods.